So Nathalie is an associate professor of French studies at the Department of Languages and Literatures of Europe and the Americas at UH Manoa. She teaches French composition, advanced French language, French-English translation, and Francophone literature. Her research and publications articulate motherhood studies with feminism and trauma theory in narratives of the Holocaust, the 1994 Rwandan genocide, and the aftermath of the nuclear tests in the Francophone South Pacific, especially Tahiti, New Caledonia, and Rwanda. She also works in the fields of translation theory and practice. She is a co-editor of Trauma and Motherhood in Contemporary Literature and Culture, and also of Francophone Oceania Today, Literature, Visual Arts, Music, and Cinema. Her forthcoming monograph is entitled Birth in the Death Camps, Maternal Subjectivity in French Holocaust Testimonial Literature. Born in France, Nathalie moved to the United States for graduate studies. She received an MA in Comparative Literature from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and a PhD in French and Francophone Studies from UCLA. She has held appointments at Virginia Tech and the University of Sydney, Australia, and fellowships in Paris, New York, London, and Berlin. She was also the recipient of the 2022 Pacific Funds for a project entitled Symposium on Cultural Expression of Climate Change Across the French-Speaking Islands of the South Pacific. So we have a very distinguished visitor here, or speaker here today, and please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. And I want to thank the Center for Biographical Research for inviting me to present my research today. Sorry, I'll take do I bring back the image? I'm also grateful to the UH Manoa Summer Endowment for the Humanities that funded some of this research that I'm presenting today. And also I'm thankful to the Paris Holocaust Memorial Museum because they allowed me to share some of the unpublished testimonies that I found there at their Centre de Documentation. So usually when you think about the Nazi extermination camps, you think about death. However, there were births also in the camps, which is less known. So among the 120,000 women who were deported to Ravensbrück, the women's camp, thousands are likely to have been expecting. Their survival in the camp depending mostly on chance, avoiding random selections, dissimulating the physical signs of pregnancy, surviving disease and injuries, and also on the year of their arrival, because before 1944 it was almost impossible to dissimulate a pregnancy, but after 1944 things starting to change. So women were successful at dissimulating their pregnancy, usually because they were at the very early stages when they arrived, incurred tremendous risk. As has been well documented by survivors' testimonies, being found pregnant during a random selection meant being sent directly to the gas chamber. Also, it is worth reminding everyone that upon arrival in the camps, women who were visibly pregnant or women who were accompanied by small children who looked to be under the age of 14 were immediately sent to the gas chambers. It is also worth noting that so the pregnancies that I'm going to talk about today were all unplanned and unwanted. So the women who arrived pregnant in the camps, they fall into two broad categories. So there are those who unsuccessfully tried to have an abortion before being arrested, and the other category is those who were unaware of their pregnancy at the time of their arrest. So once in the camps, if the women managed to conceal their pregnancies, they could only hope for the onset of labor to happen at night. There are countless descriptions in survivors' testimonies of the tortures endured by inmates who had to give birth in daylight. For instance, Madeleine Rouben, a French survivor, reports instances of fellow inmates having their legs tied by the SS so that mothers and their newborns would die in childbirth in horrible suffering. Until 1944, in the rare instances when inmates managed to give birth during the night so no one would notice, the newborn had to be smothered or drowned. Otherwise, the worst fate was when the newborn was selected for a pseudo-medical experiment. So when Ravensbrück was liberated by the Red Army at the end of April 1945, 31 babies were still alive. Out of the 522 births that had been recorded in a register kept by a Czech inmate. In Bergen-Belsen, around 200 births were registered, but the destruction of most records and the disappearance of bodies means that the exact number of children born there is not known. In Auschwitz, it is estimated that the number of births must have been in the thousands. Gisela Perl, who is an Auschwitz inmate who served there as a gynecologist, has reported how she sought to prevent various forms of violence against newborns, including murder. So thus, arriving pregnant to a concentration camp meant, in most cases, an immediate death sentence, and in the rare occurrences when an inmate was able to dissimulate her pregnancy and carry it to term, both newborn and mother were often bound to die. But today, I will actually focus on some exceptional cases of women who were able to give birth in the camps and their newborn survived. So, okay. So just quickly about the critical framework that I use in my research. So I'm a literature scholar, so I'm not a historian. So I use some literary theory about reading testimonies as literature, so doing textual analysis of testimonies. So of course, Laub and Feldman were the pioneers of testimony, Holocaust testimonies. So as they famously said, not only did survivors need to survive to tell their story, but they needed to tell their stories to survive. So usually testimonies serve a double function. They want to bear witness, but they serve as healing. So putting the trauma into words, into a coherent story, helps the survivors move on and kind of incorporate the trauma to their life story. So I also use Pascal Beau about gender, the gendering of testimonies, of Holocaust testimonies, how, especially testimonies that are given many years after the events, they are influenced by gender norms. So I work on women survivors exclusively, so they usually incorporate some gender script to make sense of the story and share it with the interviewer. And Zoe Waxman, she's an Oxford scholar who published a feminist history of the Holocaust 5 years ago. And she says that, okay, so in the US, there has been a lot of work about gender and the Holocaust. In France, not so much. But she says that even in the US, usually when historians or scholars talk about mothers during the Holocaust, they still have this essentializing discourse in which mothers are depicted as self-sacrificing, selfless. There is this stereotype of what a good mother should be. So the fate of mothers during the Holocaust is not fully studied. So because the testimonies I will present today, some of them have been published 18 years after the events. So Sarah Horowitz proposed the term of deferred testimony to talk about these very delayed testimonies. However, while she says that these testimonies are given very late because they pertain usually to shameful events such as rape or all sorts of sexual violence, the testimonies included here today are shared later for different reasons. So, yes, and I don't think I will dwell too much on the critical framework, so I don't want to run out of time. But it's also important to remember the limits of testimonies. So testimonies are a retrospective reconstruction of what happened, so they don't. So the narrator can be unreliable. The narrator is traumatized, so they are not exactly like historical documents. So they were very useful in the recording of what happened during the Holocaust. But what matters to me is how the survivors reconstruct their stories. Like which words, which tropes do they use? How do they frame the story so long afterwards? So I use a lot embodied feminism and motherhood studies. So motherhood studies are the blind spot of feminism, actually. So it's still a budding field. So in France, Clarisse Picard, she's a motherhood philosopher. She published 3 years ago, Philosophie de l'enfantement. So she says that pregnancy and childbirth are generally absent from philosophical and historical discourses. So that's why I study those narratives of giving birth in the camps, so that we can give light to something that is not talked about very much. So, yeah, feminist Holocaust scholar Zoe Waxman points the tensions between wanting to be a good mother and wanting to be a woman who survives in the differing accounts of infanticide in the Łódź ghetto. So it is now well documented that at Auschwitz-Birkenau, women who refused to be separated from children were sent to the gas chambers. However, studies of women and the Holocaust continue the theme of the dutiful mother. So Waxman criticizes Hofer and Weizmann's Women in the Holocaust, which was a very important publication in the late 90s. She said that it is still an essentialization of women, especially women as mothers. So in my book, I argue that the Holocaust provided an exacerbation of the normal tensions brought about by motherhood. So between the mother's existence as a woman and the mother as a good mother, which gave rise to a split identity. This means that women as mothers or survivor mothers suffered from additional trauma that rarely had a chance to be worked through, as it pertains to such a taboo aspect of women's so-called biological lives. So quickly, some background context about the French context of the Holocaust memory. So, like in many countries, right after the Second World War, there was silence. Nobody was interested in hearing about survivors, so there were hardly any publications. Then in the 60s, there was an emergence of the witness testimonies with the Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem and the Algerian War of Independence in France. So that's when Charlotte Delvaux, among others, were able to publish their memoirs. And then 1985 is the creation of the Shoah as a concept. And in French, we use the word Shoah, thanks to Claude Lanzmann's 9.5 hours long movie, Shoah. But still, so now in the 21st century, there are still some gaps, and especially women's voices remain disproportionately less heard. So the CNRS, which is the National Center for Research in France, they started a database about testimonies of life during the Second World War, and they found they have only 10% of women's testimonies. So there is a heavy gender bias in the construction of collective memory. So Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, yeah, it's a monumental film. However, in those 9.5 hours, there is hardly any woman voice at all. So this was, as you may know, Simone de Beauvoir was his long-term lover, feminist Simone de Beauvoir. So he's the only man she lived with, actually, because she never lived with Sartre. And she had no criticism of Shoah. She loved that movie so much. However, so it was often reproached to Lanzmann that there was no women's voices. So 1 year before his death, in 2017, he released a documentary film of 4 women's testimonies that he had edited out. And one of them is Ruth Elias. So Ruth Elias, okay, in my presentation, I will first look at 2 cases of women who gave birth in the camps, and unfortunately it ended in the newborn being killed. And in the second half, it will be testimonies of women who gave birth and their child survived. So yeah, Ruth Elias, she was Czech. She found out that she was pregnant the day after doctors in Theresienstadt had been ordered to stop performing abortions. So she was transferred to Auschwitz in June 1944, and she was 8 months pregnant. She managed to conceal her pregnancy, and then, unfortunately, she was selected by Dr. Mengele for one of his experiments. So her testimony is available online on the US Holocaust Memorial Museum website. So initially, Claude Lanzmann had left her out of his movie because he felt that women's testimonies were too emotional. He was not interested in this aspect of the Holocaust. So, but then he released her, not her full testimony, but like about 45 minutes of her testimony in his last film in 2017. So what I found is that women who unfortunately had to kill their newborn to survive during the Holocaust, the way they reframe their story years later is with this choiceless choice, so it's a lack of agency. So choiceless choice was crafted by Lawrence Langer. It's a choice you have to make when there is actually no morality, so no moral values are there. So you have to make some choice, but there is no right or wrong choice. So actually, this story was used by William Styron in his book, Sophie's Choice. But he changed it. So Ruth Elias, she had her baby in Auschwitz, and so Dr. Mengele decided to tie up her breast. He wanted to see how long it takes a baby to die when they are not fed. So it was really horrible. So she describes how there was this German nurse who decided to help her. She told her, I can give you this injection for your baby, and the baby will die without pain. So, of course, Ruth Elias said that at first she didn't want to do it, but the nurse presented her that you have no choice. If you don't do it, both of you will die. If you do it, you will survive and you will have other children after the war. So she ends up doing it, but even when she's being interviewed by Lanzmann, which is 40 years after the fact, she's still visibly shaken, and you can hear Lanzmann telling her, well, like, let's cut, he doesn't like it when she shows too many emotions. So, and then, at the Paris Holocaust Memorial Museum, I found the testimony of Edith Stern-Davidovici. She lived about the same dates as Ruth Elias, so this is not a published testimony. She was also deported to Birkenau in June 1944. So she was interviewed actually 60 years after the events, in 2005, by the Paris Holocaust Memorial. So the male interviewer keeps having to draw her attention back to the pregnancy. In fact, even all these years later, she skips about giving birth in Auschwitz. So she says, yeah, I was pregnant, and then she jumps to something else, and he keeps having to redirect her attention, but what happened? Like, what happened? Then she says it was a death march, and he says, but in between, you had the child. So then she comes back to the birth, and the subsequent death of her daughter, but she reframes them as miracles. So this highlights the reversal of values. She says there were already 2 miracles. It was 10 p.m. when she went into labor, so that means everybody was asleep, so that was a miracle. And the German nurse who helped her let me leave and chose to kill my baby. Had she not killed my baby, I would have been sure to die. And she keeps using the word miracle and miracle over and over again. She's a very religious Jewish woman. She talks about having this emunah, and this is how she survived. So she reframes the neo-Nazi as a lack of agency, which is a recurring characteristic of deferred testimonies of birth in the camps that had a traumatic outcome. So, okay, so now I jump to women who gave birth in the camp and with a happy outcome. So Madeleine Elmer-Rubel, she was also born in 1924. She was a French resistance fighter, so she's not Jewish. She was 4 months pregnant when she's deported to Ravensbrück because of her involvement in the resistance movement. So her case is very interesting because she gave many testimonies. So she gave her first testimonies in the early 1960s, then 2 testimonies in the 1980s, and every time she reframes the same story with slightly different angle. And then she published her memoir in 1997. And then her daughter also testified. So So I should read what I wrote. So in 1960s, so Madeleine Ruben gave birth in Ravensbrück. She was lucky to give birth at night, and no one noticed. And then, so in September 1944, until liberation, there was an infant's room in Ravensbrück. That's the only camp where this happened. And this is mentioned by Marie-Josée Chambard-Delot. She was a French nurse who worked as a midwife there. So she's the one who said that there were 522 babies who went through this infant's room from September 1944 to April 1945. So what happened is that birth started to be tolerated because the Nazis could see they were losing the war, but there was nothing that was made to keep them alive. So there was no heating, it was extremely cold, there was no milk, but they could stay in that room. They were eaten by rats, but the mothers were allowed to come and see them at night. So most newborns survived from 1 to 2 months. 3 months was already the maximum. So, and then towards the end of the war, when it became very chaotic, so newborns had to be hidden in a false ceiling, in a turned-off stove during roll call or selections. And then they recall how during the last night before liberation, all the women in Ravensbrück had to stand all night outside for roll call, so the babies were passed from one woman to the other, concealed under their skirts. So all the survivors' testimonies say that babies did not cry in the camps. However, Edith Stern-Davidovici, whom we just saw before, she's the only one who says that her baby cried a lot, and her baby was born at 4 kilograms, which is almost 10 pounds. So it's a different story. But all the other ones, especially those who were able to save their babies, the baby never cried, which, as if the baby had internalized that they cannot cry, otherwise they're going to be killed. So in the testimonies that Madeleine, so Madeleine gave birth on March 21st, 1945. She had a daughter, Sylvie, and liberation happened a little a month later. So Sylvie was saved. They were repatriated through Sweden, and then they came back to France in June. So her daughter survived. So in the 1960s, Madeleine Ruben emphasizes in her testimony how being pregnant was a curse. She says the labor and delivery process took place in the dark without water or electricity. It was forbidden to scream. When my water broke, it's all my translations, but it hasn't been translated into English. When my water broke, I thought I was about to die. I had never felt so alone, so hopeless. For years, I was haunted by the memory of giving birth in the camp. It was even more monstrous in my mind than it had actually been. I had recurring nightmares of the other women in the barrack whose legs had been tied so they would die in labor. And she also emphasizes in the 1960s that she had no milk. So as if it was her own agency, she keeps repeating, I had no milk, but ever since I've had 3 more children, and even when I'm not in the camp, I still don't have milk, as if it's a permanent state, I don't have milk. However, in the testimony that she published in 1997, which is called J'ai donné la vie dans un camp de la mort, so literally I gave life, or I gave birth in a death camp, she says, so she reframes her pregnancy as resistance. So from the start, she says, being pregnant was like a counterpoint to this extermination, concentrationary universe. So I survived because of my child. My child saved me. So it's a whole different approach. And she also keeps talking about the sisterhood that existed among the French inmates. So she uses we a lot instead of I, which is, according to Rachel Rosenblum, it's a sign of having healed through the trauma. So it was a communal endeavor. So she says, surviving was less difficult for me because I was pregnant and I believed in my child. Sylvie saved me. My pregnancy is a counterpoint to this deadly environment. It epitomizes life. I was carrying my child. I believed in her and she saved me. I had only survived for Sylvie. And at the end of her memoir, she says, I can now say, only now, that I do not wish I had not been to Ravensbrück. I gained a wealth of knowledge that changed me. This transformation is a kind of initiation, that of a second birth. In Ravensbrück, I was born a second time. And she displaces the birth, so her daughter gave birth to her, actually. And there are a lot of metaphors in this respect in the text. So Madeleine Rubin's testimony was fictionalized by French writer Valentine Gobi. So the novel has a German title, Kinderzimmer, but it's in French. It's about the infant's room in Ravensbrück. So the novel is set in Ravensbrück and is based on Madeleine's story and survivors' interviews. However, it's a fictionalized character, so there is a different ending. So Madeleine's child dies in Ravensbrück, and she adopts the infant son of a deceased inmate. So then she goes back to Paris and she raises his son like her own, and it's a very successful mothering story, a story of love and happiness. So Sylvie Elmer, who is Madeleine's daughter, so she never published her testimony because she doesn't want to be in the spotlight. She said she really didn't want to be always known as the Ravensbrück baby. So that's, I don't have time to talk about it today, but there have been 5 testimonies published over the past 5 years about French survivors who were born in the camps, and they all share some similarities. Like most of them suffered from severe anorexia. So Sylvie developed anorexia at the age of 6, which was, for her mother, it was like an insult. She said, the camp was going after me, even in France. So, but Sylvie was interviewed upon the publication of the novel, of Valentine Gobi's novel, and she said, I really like the ending. I've always wondered if maybe I was not my mother's biological child, because my mother was so distant, she didn't seem to love me, there was this emotional remoteness, so I felt that maybe I'm not her daughter, and then there is all these issues with having to be perfect because her mother is a heroine, etc. So that's for Madeleine. And then the last, I don't know what time it is. I don't have my phone with me.
Oh, you're doing well.
Okay, good. The last one I wanted to mention is Yvonne Salamon. Je suis née à Bergen-Belsen. I was born in Bergen-Belsen, published in 2020. So I really like Yvonne Salamon. She's a psychoanalyst for children. She lives in the south of France. So, and her memoir is really well written. So she survived for 6 months, hidden under her mother's dress. So her mother, Hélène Salamon, she was Jewish, but she was deported because of her involvement in the French resistance. But then she was transferred to Bergen-Belsen when they found out about her Jewishness. So Hélène Salamon never wrote about her story of giving birth in the camps. So I was born in Bergen-Belsen is marketed as a Holocaust testimony by the Paris Holocaust Memorial Museum, but it's actually a fiction. So we learn in the story that because Yvonne didn't even know about the truth about her birth until just before her mother died, she's just inventing. So she needs to recreate her mother's subjectivity in order to be able to move on with her own life. So Hélène Salamon became pregnant with someone who is not actually Yvonne's father, and this is probably the reason why she never talked about that. So her husband had been deported for 2 years already, and she had an affair with someone who was in the resistance movement with her, and she became pregnant with Yvonne. So after the war, both she and her husband had survived. So when her husband saw her with this 6-month-old baby, she said, "This is a Dutch baby that I have adopted from an inmate." So, okay. And then after a few months, the husband realized this was actually her baby, so she told the truth to her husband. But they didn't tell the truth to Yvonne. So Yvonne says, I was born 3 times, because initially her parents registered her on 15 August 1945, but she was born in October 1944. And then when she was about 16 years old, she started to think that at the time of her conception, how could her parents have been together? So she asked her mother, and the mother said, well, your father escaped his concentration camp for one night and he visited me and left in the morning. So there was this fairy tale narrative, which is actually documented by Rachel Rosenblum about other survivors, where they reframe, she has this famous patient with Goldilocks, so she has reframed her abandonment as some kind of fairy tale narrative that she was a chosen child. So okay, Yvonne sort of keeps on believing that, and then when she's 28, she hears the truth, and she says this was the trauma of her life, to realize that suddenly that her mother had lied for so many years, and she developed diabetes right away. So she says this was the earthquake of my life, this was the biggest explosion of my life. So her narrative, actually her memoir, is not so much for bearing witness, but she wants to kind of repair this relationship with her mother, even though her mother is not here anymore. And also she says she needs to cut this symbolic umbilical cord that has been tying her to her mother and preventing her from living her life. So it's hard to go in details, but then she writes about her own birth in her own words, but she's using Madeleine Rubin's testimony to write about her birth. So she writes about her birth in the first person singular. So a miracle happens. While you did not have any milk after your first 2 pregnancies, you find out that you have a little bit of milk. I nurse. It's a moment of sheer grace. So she tells her whole birth story in her own words. So, but her testimony is also interesting because she needs other people to bear witness to what happened, and it's actually quite spectacular because in the early 2000s, she goes to a Holocaust conference, and there is this French survivor, Francine Christophe, and Francine Christophe was 9 years old in Bergen-Belsen, and she tells a story about how her mother had kept a little piece of chocolate for her ever since they left Paris. And the mother said, I keep this chocolate for you, so if one day you're really too weak, I will give it to you. And then Francine Christophe, in her testimony, she says, oh, but that night, Madame S gave birth. So my mother decided to give the chocolate to her instead of to me. So Yvonne says, Madame S, this was my mother. So, and she remembers that her mother had one time told her that in the camps, there was this French woman who gave her a piece of chocolate when she was feeling really weak. So it's like all the testimonies are coming together, and then Yvonne tells her own story, like a quoted speech. So she reports Francine's testimony about her birth. So Francine was 9 at the time, but she tells about the birth of Yvonne, and then there is all this mise en abîme, all these embedded narratives that happen. So, yes, so just a brief conclusion. So, in most of the testimonies, so these are narratives of despair and trauma, but they are often reframed into narratives of hope and resilience, though with different strategies depending on the outcome. So most interviewed Holocaust women survivors are able to sublimate the oppressor's rhetoric of violence into a rhetoric of survival, and their narratives become performative. So in Madeleine Rubin's narrative, the deferred testimony allows for reframing of pregnancy and childbirth into acts of resistance. But in Yvonne Salamon's narrative, the memoir's ultimate purpose is to facilitate her rebirth by cutting the symbolic umbilical cord that had tied her to her deceased mother. So in this process, the author narrator needs to recreate her mother's subjectivity in accordance with her narrative of inalienable maternal love. Thank you very much.
So we have plenty of time for questions and feedback.
I don't really have an academic question. I just found this talk so very fascinating in the way in which children or newborns either break through silence, or in some cases reinforce silence, right? So, and the role of women. So I just want to share, my father lost 10 people at Auschwitz, and he would never talk about it. It's typical, right? You know this from the Holocaust literature, except he was obsessed with the baby. And so, he's a guy, it wasn't maternal, it was not his baby, but it was his uncle's baby. And only thing I ever heard about was the baby. And so there was a fascination, none of the other 9, only the baby. And so, I would always ask him questions, why are you always interested in old history? Let it go, that was a long time ago. But the only thing present about what happened was the baby. So
the baby had also perished?
Yes,
okay.
The newborn.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
That's interesting.
So this helps me understand this kind of, I don't know psychological literature at all, the psychological importance in trauma or in situations of genocide or a Holocaust of life and what babies represent.
Yeah, this is something that comes up a lot, how babies, of course, epitomize life. So also Madeleine Ruben says that her daughter was a symbol of life for all of the inmates that helped to keep her alive. And yes, I saw also in male testimonies that when they start idealizing what life will be like after the camp, they think about maybe their wife is a baby. Yes, a baby is a recurring motif. Yeah, actually, I forgot to mention something about Yvonne Salamo. So she was able to stay alive for 6 months in Bergen-Belsen. This is unheard of. Her mother was a midwife, so she had already 2 older children. So she hid her on her chest. So for 6 months, she never cried, not even a whimper. But at liberation, when she untied her daughter, she cried for the first time. So that's why she said she was really born at 6 months old. So yeah, that's amazing that a baby can actually be 6 months without crying.
Yeah. Thank you. That was really, really fascinating. I'm curious about Yvonne Solomon becoming a psychoanalyst. Did you say that she went into psychoanalysis because she'd endured a kind of trauma herself? And I don't know if she writes about that or talks about her path to that profession in her memoir, if you have anything to say about it.
So in the memoir, she doesn't really talk about it, but then she recorded a podcast for France Culture, and she said that, so she was only able to start med school in her 30s after finding out about the truth about her birth. Before that, she was unable to leave, actually. And then she says, becoming a child psychoanalyst has saved me.
Wow.
Yeah.
So another narrative of being saved.
Yes. Yeah. Yep.
Oh, thanks.
Also, she says that she decided never to have children. So this is two paths that I see in Holocaust survivors. Some of them absolutely want to have children to compensate for what happened, but others just consciously choose not to have children.
That podcast is in France Culture?
Yes, from 2021.
Thanks.
Yes.
Thank you so much for this talk. It was fascinating, and I don't have French, I don't know French, so I can't read the memoirs or really access the archives, but I do work with Jewish literature, and I am a descendant of this history. The most I've gotten from my family is the letters stopped coming, no talk of it, and what I'm interested in is, and sort of the generations of either autofiction or life writing that happens, successively from survivors to, their descendants, if you notice any sort of changes in how they're talking about it. Yeah.
Do you mean how the descendants are talking about it?
Yeah, sure.
So,
oh, sorry.
No, are you aware of Marianne Hirsch?
Yes.
Oh, yes. I think she would be the perfect person.
Yeah.
So yeah, in France, there is Aurélie Bargenet working on that. She calls that l'ère des non-témoins, the era of non-witness. So people who did not witness it but have inherited the trauma. So, but I think so. From what I saw, so there is one Jewish woman, writer that I work on, Cécile Weichbro. So her parents survived from Poland. But for her, she's concerned about voluntary childlessness. So she also decided to be childless. And she's really concerned about issues of memory, memorialization, and she draws parallels with other traumas like Chernobyl and also Hiroshima. This is something that comes up in her work. But yeah, there's so much to say about that. So
yeah, I've seen a lot on second, I guess, generation, but not much further than that. Yeah.
Oh, now the third generation
Yeah.
is also publishing
Yeah.
some memoirs. I don't know much about the US though. My work is really about France.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot.
You also work on Rwanda.
Yes.
And you didn't talk about that today, but
No.
do you find the same resonances there, or is it a different? It's a different culture, different country, different situation.
Yeah, thank you for your question. So the Rwanda is very different actually, but I think also it's because now there is how do you say that in English? Post-traumatic stress disorder is well managed, so it's actually. So there is this Rwandan survivor, Beata Umubiye-Imeres, who published her memoir in France last year, and she got several literary prizes, including from the Holocaust Memorial Museum, which is nice in the comparative genocide framework. But yeah, for her, for instance, Charlotte Delbo recorded the testimonies of all the women who were on the convoy with her to Auschwitz, those who survived. And for these women, so we're talking about the 1950s when there was no psychological help. So most of these women, they hoped that when they became mothers, it would be actually like being healed, coming back to life. But all of these women describe motherhood as the tipping point. So yeah, I didn't have time to show that slide. I'm sorry, I closed the laptop. But many of these women described that they felt that they were sort of back to normal until that time when they became mothers, and that's when all the PTSD started. One of them jumped out of the window. So, but in the Rwandan survivors' case, it's different. Maybe because I'm still working on that. Like, why is it that actually motherhood is healing for them? Becoming mothers after the genocide is really like Umubiye-Imeres, she says, it's when I became a mother that I was finally able to feel at peace and talk about my story. So there is psychological medical structures that help them to deal with that, and also it's a society that really emphasizes motherhood as central, maybe. So I'm still trying to find why it's different from Rwandan survivors. Most of them find healings through motherhood. It's a catharsis.
I just want to mention beforehand, any question I ask about this is going to sound sort of clinical, so I just wanted to register the impact of the story before I asked the question. I was just wondering, because you were talking about the variety of ways in which these narratives were recorded, whether they were in a fiction, whether they were in a generational memoir, whether they were videotaped or whatever. I was just wondering if you see any kind of changes in the way these narratives were recorded, depending on the way or how they were recorded. So, for example, the lancement is that business of being placed within the framework of the Holocaust memorial testimony. Does that tend to produce different narratives about this than when it's actually written down? Or to the degree you can, is there a difference between materials written in English as opposed to materials written in French?
Yeah, so everything I studied is in French, actually. It was just my translations today. But yeah, so testifying in a foreign language definitely creates a distance, an affect distance. But for Madeleine Rouben, because she gives so many testimonies, so yeah, in the 1960s, she was interviewed by a female interviewer, and then in the 1980s by a male interviewer, and then she published her own memoir. So there are big differences. It's not clear if the differences are because she's becoming more and more remote from the event, but I find that she's also, she's like a pioneer of feminism in my eyes, because in the early 1980s, she was videotaped by this male interviewer talking about her experience, and she keeps telling him that anywhere in the camps, women stopped menstruating. So there were no blood stains, and she keeps coming back to that. And the main interviewer is a little bit uncomfortable because in France in the early 1980s, nobody talked about that. So she makes a point of talking about that, and then she talks about her giving birth to Sylvie in the camps, which is not a question that the interviewer has asked. So she keeps coming back to that. So I found this was like a feminist performative act that she did during her testimony. But Sharon Kenkisser-Cohen is someone who really specializes in how being interviewed by a male or a female interviewer can have an influence. And she also noted that in the interviews, so when survivors are able to shift from answering questions with I, but they shift to we, that signals that they have moved on and worked through the trauma. But most of the testimonies I use, they have been written. So apart from Madeleine and Mel Ruben, and Ruth Elias, of course, interviewed by Lanzmann. So that's. But otherwise, I focus more on the written ones. So. But also, the published memoirs are usually published with a writer. So both for Rwandan survivors and for Holocaust survivors, like even Salamon, she published with Frédéric Agnès, who is a journalist and a writer. So it's as if co-writing is like the other person is kind of bearing witness to what this person is saying. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers your question.
So please join me in thanking Nathalie for really